BionicDance is filmed in front of a live studio audience.
Can we know that we are right and that other people are wrong? And if we do say that, isn't it arrogant to say that?
Extremely arrogant. And I know I'm right about that. Let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers. BionicDance here. Can we know whether we're right or wrong? And is it arrogant to tell other people so? Right from the start, the question runs into a few language problems, because when we say right and wrong, we sometimes mean factually correct or incorrect, and sometimes we mean acceptable or unacceptable. All too often, theists try to conflate the two when they're very much not the same thing, and try to use this muddled terminology to bolster their case, then ignore the living crap out of anyone who tries to point out their error. But to tell someone they're right or wrong when the issue isn't one which can be demonstrated to be so or not so, and then insisting on your determination, is arrogant. You're essentially stating opinion as fact, and that's simply not okay.
Well, that's a sentiment expressed by this guy here who claims he was a hardcore Christian but then lost his faith. Let me show you what he says here. How arrogant I was, he writes, to think that my form of small-town Southern Ontario Catholic Christianity was the only way that people could come to know God properly, when there are billions of people all over the world who reach out to all kinds of higher powers and forms of spiritual enlightenment all the time. And those people feel the same kind of assurance, peace, and goodness that I do.
And this is a very important point that gets ultimately ignored in this guy's rebuttal. Why you're God and not anybody else's? He doesn't even try to address it. And that won't be the last time I'll be forced to call him out for dishonesty, his last fallacy of omission.
The person who expresses the sentiment expressed in that challenge has bought into two lies. The first lie is empiricism. And empiricism is simply the idea that the only things that you can believe to be true are those things that are testable with the five senses.
Don't bother asking why that's a lie. He never explains it. We're just supposed to take it on his say-so that empiricism isn't the case. Seriously, see for yourself. I put a link to the video to which I'm responding in the description. Always do. I might skip some footage to save time, but never dishonestly. It's usually just repeats and rephrasings of what's already been said, never anything genuinely relevant. And I swear to you that he never once justifies his statement that empiricism is a lie. Ever.
Now, if empiricism is true, it turns out the only areas, the only subjects that you can have knowledge in are those that are studied by the hard sciences. So, for example, chemistry, physics, geology, and other things like that. Those are the only subjects that we can have knowledge in if empiricism is true.
And he gives no actual argument against this being the case. He just says if. His entire argument seems to boil down to the fact that he finds a world in which that is the case to be unacceptable. Maybe he's taking it for granted that we have knowledge in other areas, and therefore empiricism is false, but he doesn't articulate it. He doesn't show why what we consider knowledge in other areas isn't just really strongly held opinions. Instead of addressing this rather critical point, he takes it for granted that empiricism is false and moves on.
If you believe that lie, then this logically leads to a second type of lie that many people believe in, indeed the same person here who's expressed that sentiment in this challenge. It leads you to believe in the lie of relativism. And relativism is simply the idea that what's true is relative to the individual. It's relative to the subject.
And now we're back to fuzzy language getting in the way, because true does not always mean factual. We often refer to, as I said before, very strongly held opinions as being right or true. Ask multiple people which sci-fi series is best, and you'll get different answers from a lot of people. Are any of them factually correct? No, it's impossible to be factually correct because what's been asked is a matter of perspective, not merely in terms of the answer, but how the question is even judged. And yet, we can legitimately say that each person's answer is true for them. And in that way, yes, relativism exists. However, relativism does not apply to empiricism because anything that is the case empirically will remain the case regardless of how any person may perceive it or feel about it. His assertion that empiricism logically leads to relativism is bizarre because that's precisely what empiricism will void by its very nature.
And the reason why empiricism leads to relativism is because if you believe the only subjects that you can have knowledge in are the hard sciences, then all other subjects become areas which you cannot have knowledge in, and truth becomes relative in those areas.
That is an empiricism leading to relativism. If the empirical world is the only one containing factual truths, then everything else is relative, is subjective, regardless. Nothing outside of our own heads will change because of what we believe, unless, of course, we take action in response to those beliefs. But also, what does it mean to have knowledge outside of the hard sciences? Short of knowing what you yourself think, feel, or believe, what kind of knowledge can you have that isn't a result of empirical evidence or experience? Even our philosophical ideas like logic or mathematics have to be demonstrable, otherwise they're concepts, not knowledge. You can make up philosophical ideas all day long, but until you try them out in the real world, that's all they are. Ideas, no matter how reasonable they seem at first. It's like the idea of a flat Earth. It sure doesn't look like we're standing on a large sphere, does it? But until we're able to check our assumptions, we don't have knowledge. We only think we do. So I ask again, what is knowledge outside of the hard sciences? How can we know something is the case if we cannot test it empirically?
So, for example, morality, or religion, or the arts, and other areas like that that don't fall under the hard sciences, those areas that you can have a sense experience in, all those other subjects then become areas that are just relative.
Morality. Every culture, religious, regional, or secular, does seem to have its own moral and ethical quirks others don't share, as do individuals. By what standard do we judge one's correctness over the other? The arts. Art is very much an empirical thing. What we think about it is clearly relative. I'd love to see how opinions on artwork are able to be uniform and absolute, but the art itself is physical. And religion? Until you can prove that there is at least one God or other mystical force that isn't entirely imaginary or a matter of subjective experience or a matter of imagination and wishful thinking, religion certainly remains relative, it's true. But once you do prove the factuality of religion's supernatural claim or claims, like the existence of its God, then and only then can one claim to have knowledge, claim the truth of a religion, show others to be false. And he never actually voices any reason why this isn't the case. At best, he seems to be objecting to this view of reality on a childlike, but it's not fair basis. I can understand the desire for certainty, for absolutes, but that doesn't make them true, no matter how strong the wish.
And you and I can have two different beliefs, and they can be contradictory, and we're both right.
Now see, that's just bullshit. If your beliefs are contradictory, then either one of you is right and the other is wrong, or you're both wrong. But you cannot both be right. And neither of you can legitimately claim knowledge until you can show which of those possibilities is the case. Having knowledge does seem to be the sticking point. Our friend here seems to be coming from some bizarre plane of reality where you can have knowledge simply by thinking something up and without ever having to prove it. And if that's not what he's saying, he's done a good job of concealing his true message.
And this is why oftentimes when you're talking to a person who believes relativism is true, and you're trying to share your faith, maybe about Christianity, they come back with something to the extent of, oh, you believe Jesus is true? You found Jesus for yourself? Oh, that's so sweet. Oh, that's so touching. That's so great that you found Jesus to be true, but he's just not true for me. It might be true for you, but it's not true for me. And of course, that is the typical expression that we see with relativism.
I hate to break it to you, but that's not relativism. That's someone being condescending. Oh, you believe in fairies? That's so sweet. How old are you again? Your intelligence is being insulted, and the fact that you don't get that only shows it to be justified.
Now, the person who has believed these two lies, empiricism and relativism, is living in a fantasy world. They are living in the Matrix.
So let me see if I've got this right. The ones living in a fantasy world aren't those who believe in magical, universe-creating, rules-making sky gods where knowledge can be as fact-based as dreams, but rather the fantasy is being held by those who believe what can be empirically proved, who recognize that differing opinions and beliefs exist, and that it may occasionally be difficult to tell fact from fiction, necessitating caution when attempting to reach conclusions. Yeah, that's who's living a fantasy. Sure, makes perfect sense.
So how do you help someone see that they're living in the Matrix? How do you snap them out of that fantasy world into the real world? Well, I suggest you do it the way Morpheus did in the Matrix. And that is, you offer them two options. You offer them A blue pill or a red pill? And again, what you're offering them here is the truth, nothing more. Now, if they accept the blue pill, then of course they can believe whatever they want to believe. They can continue to live in this fantasy world where they believe empiricism is true and relativism is true, and that you can't have any knowledge about anything except for the hard sciences. And if they want to accept that, then they go ahead and accept that, and they continue to live in the matrix, a fantasy world that is an unlivable world.
Aha! Now we get to the crux of the matter. It's a, quote, unlivable world. But what does that mean exactly? Is it unlivable because we can't physically survive in it, or is it unlivable because he doesn't like it? Well, clearly both conclusions are meaningless. We've been physically surviving, so we can dismiss that right away. And whether he likes it or not is irrelevant to what's real. It certainly seems as though the basis for his argument is the world he wants to live in, regardless of the one that exists. And that's a fantasy world if I've ever heard of one. Now, remind me which of us needs to wake up again.
Now, if they accept the red pill, well, then they're accepting the consideration that what you're offering them is true. And here you have an opportunity to help them snap out of the fantasy world, to snap out of the matrix, and to come to realize that empiricism and relativism, although they might sound true when you talk about them, they are actually unlivable systems. People can't live consistently in the real world thinking that empiricism and relativism are true.
And still he doesn't give any coherent reason why not. It's like he thinks we already agree with him, so he doesn't need to explain.
Now, if they accept the red pill, then what I'm going to ask them is this. I'm going to say to them, what if I told you that 1 billion people around the world have accepted and adopted a system of slavery that is very similar to that we had in the United States back in the 18th and 19th century? And that is that 1 billion people are kidnapping Africans from their countries, bringing them to their own country, and owning them like property. Would you say that those 1 billion people are wrong? Would you say that it is arrogant for you to say that those people are wrong?
That depends on how you judge right or wrong in this context. Can you give me a way to evaluate this hypothetical scenario where it doesn't come down to an opinion or a gut feeling? Can you show me why your conclusion is right and the slave master's opinions are wrong? Why anybody should accept your position and not theirs? I'm not saying I'm in favor of what they're doing, but I have no illusions that I'm following an absolute. I'm firmly aware that this is my opinion, and aware that it's entirely based on my empathizing with the slaves, on knowing I wouldn't want to be in their position, on knowing that if I were in their position, I'd want free people to fight for me, and so I really ought to fight for them. It's a kind of mutual self-interest, karma, paying it forward, however you want to phrase it. Can you explain to me the source of that feeling if it's not my personal preference for how life should be lived? And don't go telling me your God is the source. That's just moving the goalposts. If I've been instilled with this alleged virtue by your patron deity, then I've only been imbued with your God's moral opinion. Try again.
Now, if I present them with that option, I'm hoping that their intuitions will kick in. That they'll say, oh, no, wait a minute. That can't be the case. If there's 1 billion people who believe in that type of slavery, then they're just wrong, right? You can't do that. You can't own people. They're not property.
He wants their instincts to kick in. In other words, he wants us to treat our gut feelings as facts, our opinions as absolutes. You can't treat people as property? Says who? Where is that written as an absolute rather than an opinion or preference? And do I need to point out the parts of the Old Testament that say slavery is just so totally groovy? And do we want to say God wrote that part? Or was that a human idea? You choose. The instincts of humans are not to be trusted. Let's try intellect instead.
But notice, if they are willing to say that slavery is wrong, if they're willing to accept that as a true claim, well then of course that is not a claim that can be tested with the 5 senses. You can't taste it, touch it, smell it, hear it, see it. The idea that slavery is wrong is a philosophical concept. It's not a concept that is testable with the hard sciences. And so therefore, by them acknowledging that slavery is wrong is something that we can have knowledge in, that we can know that that's true, and that it is not relative to each person, but that in reality, even if 1 billion people adopted that type of slavery, they would be still wrong.
What, because you or I said so? What about the other 1 billion people who didn't agree? Why doesn't their say-so carry just as much weight? What makes you or I so special that our declaration of something as right or wrong is fact, is knowledge, rather than us being full of ourselves, if not completely full of shit? Do please explain.
If they can acknowledge that, then of course relativism is false, and empiricism is false as well.
Those things are false because some random schmuck on the street agreed with you. Who knew they had such power?
Now, it's certainly possible, though, that they want to say, no, I don't want to accept that. I just want to accept the blue pill, right? They just want to believe what is politically correct because, frankly, it's easier for them to do that.
Politically correct? When did that enter the discussion? If anything, claiming that human rights are not a human construction, that they're innate and unquestionable, that is politically correct, even if it's intellectually false and unsupported by the evidence. The notion that morality might be a human construction frightens some people, because it means there isn't an unquestionable rulebook we all have to follow. It means we're on our own, and at the mercy of our own perspective and conscience. It means that the peace and tranquility we've come to enjoy is precarious, and this makes some people insist on their more comfortable worldview, truth be damned.
As an ambassador for Jesus Christ, your job is simply to present the truth in a persuasive and gracious way, and you let them decide. You leave the results up to God, if you will.
You're going to have to work on that persuasive part, pal. I've heard more intellectual arguments from 6-year-olds trying to get a later bedtime, and more facts from your average UFO abductee.
Now, of course, you want them to swallow the red pill because you want to snap them out of reality. You want to snap them out of reality. You want to snap them out of reality.
Paging Dr. Freud, your slip is showing.
Because after all, that's the only chance they'll have of meeting the real Trinity.
The real Trinity? You mean A New Hope, Empire, and Jedi? I don't need a red pill for that. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please, think. Vote me down and I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.